We will start now in terms of recording, and just want to make sure that everybody knows that they can ask questions as we go along. We certainly have time at the end for questions, but don't necessarily want you to be burning with a question and not be able to ask that.
So you can either, if you have a question, you can either type it into the chat box, or you can raise your hands and we will unmute you.
All right, so just in terms of the agenda and the flow, welcome again. And the overview is just pretty much going through specific RFP portions that we've highlighted that are related to DV Housing First. Kendra will talk about eligible activities, including emergency financial assistance. Lee will be joining on the emergency financial assistance. And again, ask questions throughout, raise your hand if something just is burning and you need to ask that, and then there will be room at the end also. How are we doing? Are there any questions so far? No? Okay. So just starting out with things to know about VOCA. And you know, one of the things that I've heard when I brought this up in the past, that VOCA money can be used for DV Housing First, or, you know, just in general, as people have been applying for VOCA money to help with their expansion of services, is that uncertainty. Well, we're afraid it's going to go away. We just aren't sure if we should do this, if it's only going to last a year. And the information that we consistently have been getting is that VOCA is believed to be pretty stable at the federal level, and actually is more stable than many other funding sources. Not that you should panic about that, but any public funding source can certainly be questionable. VOCA is actually more stable than most. Another reminder is this process is competitive. The application RFPs that have just come out are very competitive, so don't make assumptions that those reviewing will know the work that you do or know your agency and its services. Be very clear, be very specific when you start negotiating that application. The deadlines are approaching, not far away. And be creative, and for heaven's sakes, ask for what you want with that money. Really look at your community, think about the needs, think about how your agency can better respond to those needs. And ask for what you want and be very clear. So the first one coming up is that VOCA Service Enhancement expansion. That is up to $190,000 for a 2-year period. It can support needed direct emergency assistance to meet crime victims where they are to the fullest extent permissible within VOCA funding requirements. It also can encourage the development and testing of service delivery strategies that meet the needs of crime victims who may have difficulty accessing currently available services. So for those of you who are already familiar with DV Housing First, that is that ding, 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 meeting people where they are. So if there's a challenge for folks to get to you, this is your opportunity to really build in that infrastructure, the transportation, the time, the advocacy to reach people who might otherwise have difficulty getting to you. So obviously that includes mobile advocacy and certainly case management if you're also working with other sorts of housing-related grants. The link to the application should be embedded in your PowerPoint that you've got pulled up. So please read it very thoroughly so that you don't miss anything. This is not a presentation to go through the application per se. It's just basically talking about some things that you can be thinking about in terms of DV Housing First. It is due by April 17th, coming right up there. The final results will be announced mid-May, and successful applicants will have a 2-year contract, July 1st, 2019 to June 30th, 2021. So you've got a good, solid year to be working on this and to make your case about how wonderful you and your services are and what your expansion is looking like. This other possibility that's coming up is VOCA services for victims and survivors to address unmet needs. This is up to $400,000 that each agency may ask for, and this is for a 2-year period. And an additional priority when you look at this application, it is given to proposals that address housing assistance and mobile advocacy for DV survivors. So this is an additional priority for those 2 areas. Its services and expenses would include, again, mobile advocacy and case management, speaks to relocation and housing support, as well as emergency financial assistance. There's also a link to this application. It's due by April 30th. That announcement will be late May, and successful applicants will have a 2-year contract running July 1st, 2019 through June 30th to 2021. So both of those have some significant investments that you can really think about and be creative about. There will also be another possibility coming up. It's not out yet. It will be released soon. And that is the VOCA culturally and community specific services for those of you who are really addressing and responding to culturally specific communities. The anticipated due date will be mid-August, and successful applicants will have a 3-year contract running October 1, 2019 to September 30th, 2022.
So it looks like we have someone with a question.
Okay.
So Heidi, I am going to allow you to talk, and then I'm going to unmute you. And I think we are ready for your question. We cannot hear you. You might have to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Oh.
Hello?
Okay, it looks like Heidi's trying to talk.
Oh, can you hear me? Can you hear me? I'm sorry.
Okay, we cannot hear you, Heidi.
Can you toggle back and forth? Sometimes if I toggle.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Okay, I think everyone except for us can hear Heidi.
I'll type it out. I can
while
type
we
the question.
While we
try to figure
toggle.
this out. Okay, Heidi, can you? Heidi, can you talk again? I
Hi.
see your question in the chat, but I want to figure out how we can
I'm
hear people.
can you hear me now?
Your speaker.
I don't know what else to.
Ask her to talk to me. Heidi, can you talk again?
Okay. Hi.
Oh, hold on.
Oh, there.
Okay,
Now try it.
can you try?
Can
you try? Oh, there we go.
Yes.
Okay, woohoo, we figured it out.
Hi.
Thank you. Okay, we're ready for your question.
Okay, well, so can you apply, well, 2 things. I have 2 questions. One is it frowned upon to apply for the same program for both, like, April deadline grants? I mean, I plan on applying for the April 30th due date, the unmet needs.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, it's like, does it better your odds by submitting it for other things? Is that, that's one question. And the other question that I have is the second bullet point for the unmet needs grant. You said mobile advocacy for DV survivors. Does that also include sexual assault victims as well?
Absolutely.
Okay.
On your first question, I don't think we can really answer that in terms of improving your odds by applying for both. that kind of sounds to me like you're thinking about applying for both for the same sort of thing. I'm not sure, or is that what you mean? Or are you thinking about two separate applications?
Well, right. I mean, I was just literally just really focused on this April 30th grant, but then this other grant, and I was like, well, that program kind of falls under that description as well. Should I just submit it then as well? I mean, that's kind of what I was, not to be flippant, but I was just.
Right.
Someone else just asked that question too.
Yeah.
If it can be, if you can apply for 2 grants at once.
Yeah.
You know, that's a question that I would just feel a need to defer. We're not really here to answer some of the specifics about the application process. I know we have people on that might be able to answer that, but I'm not sure if they really can either.
Okay.
It might be a good question directly to the VOCA administrator, to whomever is listed in the contact. I think there's 2 different contacts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there are, and I'll talk about this in a little bit too, there are application coordinators for each of these solicitations, and their names are like in the application themselves. If you go to the Commerce website and look at the applications, and you could email them and ask them, and I bet they could give you an answer to that.
Okay.
And we can give you their contact information too, if that would be.
No, I can find it. That's fine. That's fine. So we have specific questions, because I have more questions about like this grant, but it sounds like that isn't this conversation. So.
Right. We're not here to answer detailed questions about the actual application and the process. This really is to help people who are interested in doing DV Housing First approach.
Okay.
With their people, to see how this can really help them do that. This is a possibility.
Perfect. Okay, thanks.
Does that help? Are there any other questions? So just in terms of what's coming up next in the next slide. Yeah. So for those of you who aren't familiar with DV Housing First activities, this is so what is that? What are you talking about? And the components include survivor-driven, trauma-informed mobile advocacy. That is the services package that advocates are providing to survivors of domestic sexual violence. That's what we do best. And in terms of the mobile advocacy in particular, being able to get out and meet people where they are, to accompany them to the places they need to go, and to support them along the way, and perhaps get out of our facilities a little bit in order to do that. Flexible financial assistance is a huge part of DV Housing First, and more it's becoming a huge part of other federal grants, such as VOCA, many of the HUD dollars, as well as our local commerce. Consolidated homeless grant money is also becoming more available for flexible financial assistance. So it's important to negotiate this and really understand what's eligible under the different sorts of funding sources. And finally, community engagement. One of the most critical things about survivors being able to thrive, to settle in safely and stably into their original housing or new housing is that sense of their community, their social network. This includes work with landlords, and we've been partnering with Lee Hoffheimer as far as what she's doing with home visitor programs. Lee?
Hi, everybody. So I think the VOCA funding opportunity is really exciting. And when I think about community engagement, some of you may have been working with me around supporting partnerships between advocacy programs and home visiting programs. And some of you may be involved in the projects where we're actually been using flexible funding assistance. But it just really raises the issue of, getting out into the community for sure, possibly going to someone's home or meeting at McDonald's or the library. And so like having enough staff to be able to do that and seeing the VOCA funds as an opportunity to help support your mobile advocacy. Obviously landlords come to mind, but not a but, and there are other ways and other where staff could be supported and have more capacity to be able to work in the community. And I think that our relationships with home visiting programs across the state is going to be growing because they're finding out more about us. They're so unique in that some of them are working with families until up to age 4 or 5. It's also like a prevention strategy. They share a lot of our same values. So that's going to be coming up more and more. So I'm just hoping that you all consider that as a description or an example of an activity under community engagement that you could talk about and help support your staffing with.
So finally, just the reminder about Housing First, particularly as it pertains to DV survivors, is that what we're doing is trying to help survivors remain in their existing housing if they can feel safe and stable in that housing, or to access new safe and stable housing. And the idea of Housing First is that we aren't putting out any preconditions in order to support them. And of course, we know just based on our regular domestic violence advocacy work that we're not supposed to be telling people or mandating services. So this is just the emphasis that with Housing First, as well as with our traditional DV response to survivors, that we're not telling them what they have to take advantage of, that they have to be in a certain housing situation, or that we need to know them for a certain period of time before we can provide them with flexible financial assistance or with our advocacy support. So that reminder, and now for some getting into the weeds.
Do they have any questions about that?
Does anyone have questions and before we move on about the model? So I'm going to talk about the current VOCA solicitation and how certain activities and services are eligible through VOCA. So there is a long list of services and expenses that are eligible under VOCA, and we just went through and pulled out the areas that were most relevant to DV Housing First. So I do encourage you all to go into the solicitations themselves and look at the list and read through them. If you haven't already seen, I'm just going to pull up the solicitation. So the solicitations are on the Commerce website. And then the ones we're talking about are the services to victims and survivors to meet unmet needs. And then the service enhancement and expansion. The lists of eligible services and expenses are the same in each, but it's good to look through. I also just want, before I start digging into the separate lists around expenses and activities, I just want to reflect, what Linda said in terms of we're not necessarily here to go through the application themselves. And if you have really specific questions around certain things, if they're okay to apply for, or if they would fall under eligibility, we really encourage you to reach out to the application coordinators of each of those solicitations. I was also told that if you submit a question to them, they'll reply to you via email, and then they'll also include that in the FAQ that they're like often updating. So it's a good idea to also, if you have a question, start with that FAQ because it might already have the answer to your question. So eligible DV Housing First services and activities that are included in these solicitations. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through this list and also give an example to help sort of connect the dot between what is eligible and what it could look like in terms of DV Housing First. It's just one example. It's not the only example. There are a lot of things that you could potentially do. This is a very broad solicitation. People have been doing really creative things with it. So don't take this as the only example, but I just want to help you all connect the dots for those who may not have a lot of knowledge or experience around DV Housing First. So case management and the management of practical problems created by victimization. This really falls under advocacy and helping create those networks for folks in terms of accessing services. The management of practical problems created by the victimization related to DV Housing First. For an example, that could be negotiating with a landlord over damages to an apartment that was due to domestic violence. Identification of source resources available to the victim. That would be, spending the time to look out into your community and see what types of resources are located in your community and connecting those resources to the victim. The providing information, referrals, advocacy, follow-up contact for continued services. A lot of what we talk about in DV Housing First is providing that short-term and also long-term support for survivors as they go through the ups and downs of becoming safe and stable. So this would be part of that, the staffing, the time that's spent on providing that information to survivors, connecting them with other community resources, doing that warm handoff. The coordination of system partners, so development of working relationships and agreements, whether they're formal or informal, among programs and services with the role in the array of victim service provision with the goal of improving service delivery. Yeah, that's a long one. Both services and expenses are eligible under that, including mobile advocacy, so the staffing, the mileage reimbursement, the time that it takes for advocates to go out and develop those relationships with housing homeless providers, landlords, home visitor programs, and really anything that you could make the case that would be enhancing a victim service system for survivors. And then one thing I wanted to pull out, the last bullet, that could be related to mobile advocacy depending on your agency and how you provide that. For some organizations, you might have like an actual vehicle that's owned by the organization and that helps facilitate the mobile advocacy. This would allow organizations to lease a vehicle or repair a vehicle owned by an organization. And I just want to point that out because this is a little bit different from past solicitations where it was allowed to write in the purchase of a vehicle, but this doesn't allow that. You can lease, but you cannot, this time you cannot purchase a vehicle. So Heidi had a question if we could give an example of coordination of systems partners. And the example that I just used was developing relationships with your local housing homeless organizations, landlords, home visitor programs. Is that enough, Heidi, or do you want another specific example of that? So time spent, time spent meetings, conference calls, mileage reimbursement. It would not include the money that you would spend to take a landlord out to coffee. It would include the time and not the actual coffee or the actual, bread or donuts, but the time spent and the reimbursement for that in terms of mileage if your advocates are going out to the community to develop those relationships.
Yeah. We've joked a lot about developing relationships and how important it is for advocates to be able to spend the time, have that set aside time to work on those relationships. And, of course, it's always nice to bring donuts or coffee, and that might be on you. Or there could be other flexible financial assistance that could potentially be part of that in terms of your own funds. But just being able to make those connections, and it's so important to set aside the time. We hear a lot about advocates being stretched and overworked and all over a certain jurisdiction in terms of responding to survivors, and then it's like that extra straw of, and develop these relationships too. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the things to think about with either one of these applications. Perhaps the first one in terms of expansion, that maybe you need an additional advocate to broaden your ability to do this sort of response.
Yeah. Heidi also asked a question if assistance with legal expenses would be qualified. In terms of an expense, I'm actually going to talk about ineligible activities, and civil legal aid is an ineligible expense. But it would be, I would assume that if someone's doing it as part of advocacy, like they're developing relationships with someone in the legal system, or they're doing legal advocacy, I would assume that the advocacy related to that would be, but the actual direct assistance can't be used for civil legal aid. Yeah, or representation. And just to clarify that the VOCA funds, okay, well, someone is saying that you should ask the application coordinator around if food and beverage related to developing relationships would qualify. So don't take our word that it wouldn't, ask.
All right.
Something to just be aware of that it may not, so ask. Oh, and just one more thing on that I forgot to mention on the services and activities. Broadly speaking, services that respond to the immediate needs of survivors, including advocacy and emotional support, sort of like the broad, like, goal. It doesn't, in the application, it does not say children, but in the application it says services that respond to the immediate needs of survivors, including emotional support. So that could mean a lot of things. Okay, so going into the emergency financial assistance. So in general, emergency financial assistance is to go for costs related to immediate health and safety. So that would include emergency food, shelter, clothing, transportation, window, door, or lock replacement or repair. We've seen that a lot in the DV Housing First work. Other repairs necessary to ensure safety. So for example, if there was, again, if there was damage done to an apartment related to violence, and that damage was putting someone at risk of becoming homeless, that repair would sort of fall under emergency financial assistance. Emergency non-prescription and prescription medicine. So it has to be emergency. It can't be an ongoing expense that the assistance can go toward. But if someone doesn't have their pills right now and needs them, then this assistance can support that. Birth control pills, emergency birth control, I would assume, but it couldn't provide like the copay for birth control on a monthly basis.
Injury.
So it also would include emergency medical equipment and other healthcare items. So wheelchairs, crutches, hearing aids, eyeglasses, but generally does not cover emergency room visits, surgery, all that stuff.
But crutches is good.
Crutches,
Scooter is good.
Wheelchairs, so anything that's emergency. Okay. Any questions related to the emergency financial assistance? So under the category of relocation and housing support, so things that are eligible under that include travel, going to look for housing, helping to support someone to get, a gas card so they can, or get gas in their car so that they can go to search for housing, moving expenses, moving costs like storage units. Sometimes people have to get storage units.
Credit checks.
Yeah, well, that would be under the rental assistance. But credit checks, background checks, like moving trucks, all the stuff that's related to moving someone into a new home. Rental assistance, which is fairly straightforward. Security deposits.
Just want to say a little bit more about rental assistance because people so frequently want to put limits on it because we get used to what rapid rehousing is or has become defined in many of our local jurisdictions where you're looking at 3 to 6 months worth of rental assistance. There is not that limit under VOCA. And I'm watching programs, again, in other states that are comfortably figuring out how to support survivors for anywhere from 6 months to 12 months and sometimes beyond with rental assistance so that they can retain their housing safely and securely.
Great. And then there's security deposits, utilities, and I want to say for rental assistance and for utilities, that also includes arrears. So like past due debt related to those two things, and then other costs that would be related to the relocation of housing, including costs to keep someone in their own home. So a lot of like that specific bullet is really broad, I think, in the sense and for the purpose so that, you know, people can have some flexibility around helping survivors really identify what it is that will support them in either staying in their own home or keeping them in their home. The broad statement around the relocation and housing support really is that it just has to be connected to the victimization. And so there's, a lot of wiggle room in here. And again, the application coordinators could really help if there are like really creative, like outside of the box questions about this, they can help with answer that.
People still my own rent. No.
Okay, so Heidi has a question. So she asked, as someone who has applied for financial housing assistance in the past, is there a formula that would be advisable? I think I need more clarification on that question. What do you mean by applied for financial housing assistance in the past, Heidi? You're unmuted if you want to talk.
Well, I guess I'm sorry for all the questions. I feel like I'm the only one asking questions. Sorry. But I guess my question is that it's such a broad. We've run up against this with other grants in the past. It's such a broad, like rental assistance is so broad. And when you say things like, well, you could pay for like 6 months of someone's rent, and for us being a smaller community, you have a small pool, so we could never say yes to that because otherwise we'd use everything we have in one fell swoop. And so it's always just this balancing act. And so I'm curious if they are truly funding like a reasonable amount of services. I guess I'm curious what other organizations have used. Is there like a formula they use of like, okay, we're gonna potentially. I mean, it just seems so broad, and it's hard to figure out like what would be a realistic number that would that they might be like, yeah, that makes sense. So it feels, yeah.
Anyway, I'm sorry, but the whole idea is to be flexible and really respond to the needs of that survivor. And
right.
Programs that I know that are doing this and aren't successful in doing this tend to sit with that budget and the reality of how long will it take for you to assume the entire month's rent or the entire rent.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes they do it in a graduated form, like we'll pay maybe 70% of the rent this first month, maybe we'll do 50% the next month. Sometimes if there's more impacts and trauma on this individual, the victimization and the horrors, the other things somebody needs to be working on, they can't really think about employment and how they can contribute. So that might mean you pay full cost for a few months. But the reality is that you're not just operating in a vacuum, but you're working with that survivor on what is the reality. And being flexible enough that you don't put down a directive that everybody is going to get the exact same. And I know that in a small community, that's really challenging because everybody compares notes in many ways. But it's a matter of being able to say we try to be responsive to the needs, and we really try and work with somebody on what they need to do ultimately to assume these costs completely on their own. And let's see what kind of plan we can put into place. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes. Thanks.
So sort of on that topic, Heidi, is it for folks who are successful applicants and receive these funds prior to being able to like administer the funds or receiving reimbursement from them, applicants do have to submit and have an approved plan that includes the policies and procedures for providing relocation housing support services. That's not to say that you have to put anything in there around like caps or numbers or whatever, but I think it's something that every program has had to sit down and really think about, and take a look at their community, what their community needs, and then also just making sure that there's flexibility in that, because we all know that survivors' lives are complex, and some people need more support than others, and that a lot of times those caps don't always necessarily meet the needs of every individual depending on their situation. So now I'm going to go over the list of ineligible DV housing first expenses, and again, there's a much longer list of ineligible expenses in the solicitations themselves. So I encourage you to go and look at those applications. These are the ones that we pulled out. Linda's going to talk a little bit about compensation for crime victims.
Right, and that might look a little surprising that that is an ineligible expense. However, when we think about the importance of being able to tie whatever is provided to the victimization, sometimes that direct compensation for an expense that's already been put out, it's hard to make that tie. That's where you need other sources of flexible financial assistance, because your auditor as well as VOCA need to have a really clear piece of documentation that what you are providing is that third-party rent directly to the landlord, with the clarification that this is a part of that victimization and ultimately the need for stability. And sometimes just distributing different gift cards or distributing cash, which in our other part of the DV Housing First world we will do, but you can't do that with this pot of public funds.
Okay.
Are there questions about that?
So some of the other ineligible costs include civil legal aid and assistance, and I want to make a clarification on this because it's something that came up earlier, that this expense is ineligible for the enhancement and expansion, but it may be eligible for the unmet needs. So just keep that in mind when you're applying, and the difference between those applications for this specific expense. Most medical costs are not covered, so that would include hospital, emergency room, surgery, inpatient treatments, those kinds of expenses. Again, if there is a emergency medical cost, that would be covered. And then education and or job training expenses. And there's an asterisk there because there is a note in the application that says that OCBA and DSHS has heard from the field that there is a huge need around this, and that they are seeking clarification for allowability of this. So maybe future years it'll be available, but at this given moment it's not.
Watch for it, because other states do allow for job training expenses in particular.
Mm-hmm. And then vehicle purchase for clients is not allowed, but a vehicle repair is okay.
Does that include tires?
Yes, repair would include tires.
So are there any questions about that quick run through of eligible, ineligible expenses? I know that you very well might need to poke and probe for more details, especially if you are awarded this money. But just again, being very thoughtful and creative about what you see victims of crime needing, survivors of domestic sexual violence, other crimes as they're coming to you, and being able to respond to that with the flexibility of both your advocacy work, your accompaniment, as well as the money is really important. So just the final remember list, again, this is competitive. It's not a sure thing, as all of you know, both of these processes are competitive. And do your very, very best to think through and plan together with your staff, with advocates, on what it is this might look like so that you can have a great, sound application. And that you're very clear with the people who might be reviewing what your application is. They don't necessarily know you or your agency. And you know what, even if they do and they know that you do great work, unless you specifically outline that and call it out, there really isn't the room for a person who's rating an application to give you extra points just because they know you do great work. You need to say that in the application. Ask for what you want. We've already mentioned that, and I just want to add, be realistic about it. When you're thinking about the activities you're proposing and matching a budget with those activities, it's important that they look realistic together, that you really know what it does cost for an advocate or two in your community to transport people to far corners of your rural county, that you are adequately preparing for that, that you're thinking about, you know, just the capacity of an advocate. You might not need to put how many people you're serving or plan to serve in your application, but as you think about your advocate capacity, think about how many people that advocate can really support. So be realistic about your budget. Remember that you will need to identify match money for these. Review the application for details. Just the reminder again, VOCA is believed to be stable at the federal level. That's what we're hearing from all over the country, and very discreetly from the powers that be in the VOCA offices. And the deadlines are fast approaching. Are there questions, comments? While you're thinking about a question, I've got one final reminder or comment, is that we also have a webinar scheduled for May 28th. That's a Tuesday from 1 to 2:30. And the purpose of that webinar is to really dig into the nuts and bolts of flexible financial assistance. And of course, we'll be highlighting the flexible financial assistance that comes through VOCA, but we'll also be talking about more flexible financial assistance that might come from other sources, and how you can think about integrating that into your agency protocols and the work that advocates can do, and just the wonderful barriers that flexible financial assistance can really remove in terms of your work with survivors. So that will be on the horizon, May 28th. So did anyone think of questions?
Any comments, thoughts?
I want to say, isn't this exciting?
Who knows? Is everybody applying who's on this call? No answer? Don't know yet?
Okay, someone said yes. One
Woohoo!
person is.
Yes.
Woohoo!
We hope to.
Yeah.
Right.
I just
Awesome.
want to say go for it. It's
Yeah.
so worth it. Oh my gosh, $400,000 possible for 2 years?
Yep. Build your fiefdoms.
Yes, my gosh.
Build your programs.
You will have some time to just really put together some great services, breadth and advocacy, and make the case, because your great work can be used around the country to continue to make the case for VOCA, so that we make sure that Congress never raids VOCA money for anything else.
Yay.
Let's see, Susie, I'm seeing culturally and community-specific RFP for DV services only. I mean, this is Victims of Crime Act, so it wouldn't be just for DV. When we're looking at this particular pot of money, it is for any crime victim. So, of course, we talk about DV housing first, but I know that New Hope is, of course, an agency that is dual, serves domestic sexual violence as well as victims of crime. So this money definitely, and the program proposals would definitely be for more than just DV services. Yeah, sorry to come leading in with that DV housing first. It's just that I get so excited about being able to make that connection. But when we look at whether it's VAWA or whether it is the VOCA money, FIPSA money, we're really looking at including sexual violence.
And I think it's probably pretty clear, but just to reiterate on the portion that Linda was talking about, that it's a competitive process, is that you know, these solicitations are open to any program providing services for you know, it's for sexual assault, DV, and crime victims. So it's not just for DV. So it's just good to remember that all kinds of people are potentially applying for these funds.
Anything else? It is looking like we can wrap up.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Unless there's any final burning questions, you know how to reach us. Just again, in terms of the content of this webinar and what we've been trying to talk about. And you know that for the very detailed questions you might have for the application, there is contact information for you to reach out to those people. Thanks so much for joining us. Good luck with your applications. We're excited.
Thanks, everybody.